Hello and good morning. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm here to bring you a little review of Manchester City's victory over Newcastle United on Saturday night. It's currently Sunday morning, about 10 to 9, so apologies if I sound a little bit groggy because I've got a bit of a cold as well. But on we go with a look at last night's game. It was a really good opportunity, I think, missed for Newcastle in a way. I mean, as good as an opportunity you can get at the Etihad as an opposing team who hasn't won there in the league at all and hasn't won at Manchester City since 2000 and only one victory at that stadium at all. But the context around the game was quite interesting because Pep Guardiola, the Manchester City manager, was clearly quite concerned about the game. I think in his pre-match press conference he was constantly talking about getting the fans on side. You know, the fans are going to have a big part to play in the game, and you know, he was worried, I think, about Kevin De Bruyne not being there. Bernardo Silva wasn't there as well. There were doubts over Ruben Diaz and Julian Alvarez, who both obviously played, and obviously Alvarez scored the winner in the end. While Newcastle came into this game obviously having won 5-1 against Aston Villa and were on top of the league and looked really, really good, and looked like they could cause some problems with their intensity and going forward, and it really felt like there was an opportunity there for Newcastle to make something pay. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case really. I think there was a sense that Man City were there for the taking, and certainly in the second half when they'd obviously had that game in midweek, the Super Cup in Athens against Sevilla, which they won on penalties, so that went to the distance, and Guardiola only made 2 changes. He was clearly quite short of options, and there was a possibility for Newcastle, who went unchanged, to have a really good go at that team with no De Bruyne, as I say, no Silva. If you looked at the midfields, Newcastle obviously going with Sandro Tonali, Bruno Guimaraes and Joe Linton against Mateo Kovacic, Rodri. You could say they could get at them with the right intensity and the right pressure, and you would say that they would have a good chance of getting through them. But for me, there just wasn't enough once Man City reacted to what Newcastle did, and Newcastle started off as I expected them to. They sat deep to counter the threat of Haaland, knowing that their pace wasn't particularly good at the back, and Haaland is the worst player you can possibly give a head start to with a high line. But they sort of countered that with a really deep defensive line. Botman and Schär marshalled him all night fantastically well, despite Schär obviously almost dislocating his shoulder in the very first minute. He was brilliant, so was Botman. They were fantastic at dealing with Haaland, which is another thing. If you can deal with Haaland against that team, you should have an opportunity to get a result. Early on, Newcastle were able to spring through midfield. They were able to get the ball to Tonali and Bruno Guimaraes and get the ball forward to Isak and Gordon particularly, and Almiron up front, and Trippier was getting involved as well. And the goal came from the kind of moment that really changed the complexion of the entire game, where he pushed Kyle Walker up against Dan Burn and used his pace to get at what is effectively Newcastle's weakest position in terms of a player who's not particularly quick and a player who's out of position. That's the place you've got to hurt Newcastle, and that's what Guardiola recognised. He put Kyle Walker there, which allowed Phil Foden, who was on the right wing, to sort of cut inside, really hurt Newcastle in between the lines, and he started to do that. He came inside, he found Alvarez, and Alvarez scores on a finish that potentially Nick Pope might feel like he could have done a little better with, but generally speaking, it was just a fantastic goal and kind of symptomatic of the entire reason why Man City won the game, because Phil Foden just enjoyed coming in from that moment on and just found all those spaces. Walker really caused Burn problems, and that was just the way that Man City kept Newcastle at arm's length, particularly in the first half. In the second half, Newcastle did get back into their rhythm a bit. They found some spaces. They had opportunities in the second half. You know, you got that Bruno Guimaraes scuff shot. You got that agonising thing with Callum Wilson, who came off the bench for Alexander Isak, where he couldn't quite get past Josko Gvardiol to find Miguel Almiron, who would have been through after Rodri was robbed in midfield. There were countless opportunities. Elliot Anderson had a cross that he overhit. There was just that little bit. They didn't kill the chances. That sort of told us to why Newcastle didn't get a draw. Man City were agonising for the full-time whistle by the end. They were tired. They were there for the taking if Newcastle were brave enough and intense enough, and their pressing wasn't there. Eddie Howe was talking about not bringing their A game, and I think that's really true. I think there just wasn't enough of what Newcastle did against Aston Villa and have done in previous games. And really, that's quite. It's not. I wouldn't. I don't think you can say it's worrying because it's Manchester City, where they're the best team in the world, and they'll probably win the Premier League and probably have a good chance of, on paper, winning the treble again. But when you consider that Newcastle are coming into the game in that form, in that shape, when Manchester City are that tired and have that many injuries, this was the time you could have made that strike. And if this was the time to come up and perform like that, and they didn't do that, and I think that shows how far they've got to go. Obviously, it's interesting how the narrative has turned round on Newcastle a little bit in the last couple of weeks. Before the season started, we were talking about 7th place, 6th place, and then suddenly they beat Aston Villa 5-1 and they're title contenders, and it'll be interesting to see where the narrative goes from this. But I think really what this has shown, and what everybody really who's watched Newcastle knows, is that the truth is that Newcastle are somewhere in the middle of that. They're not in a title position because they don't have the killer instinct, the mentality, and the understanding of the game understanding. I think that was what proved yesterday. Mateo Kovacic was the underrated player in the game. I was saying to a friend before the game, I thought that was an opportunity for Newcastle to really make that count. You know, the outnumbering in midfield was an opportunity, and I think that Tonali and Bruno Guimaraes can really, and particularly, and Joelinton as well, can really harm those two players when there's no creative outlet on paper in De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva. But Kovacic was a Rolls Royce because he almost man-marked Joelinton, and Joelinton didn't have any impact on the game, which basically then made it 2-on-2 almost. And Newcastle just didn't stamp their authority in that midfield. Bruno Guimaraes it was one of his poorest games. Tonali really struggled to get into it again. It was a moment that brought Newcastle down to earth again after that sky-high victory over Aston Villa. And I think, you know, Almiron has copped a lot of criticism from supporters. I thought he worked really hard again, but again in the key moments he just wasn't there, and it was a really difficult game for Alexander Isak as well. So in an attacking sense, it was really disappointing. I thought Newcastle could have done much more, and I was expecting much more from them. What they did really well against Aston Villa last week, when they got a little bit of adversity, was they went up a level, and everyone went up a level, and they imposed themselves. Now, it's Manchester City away. There is only so much imposing you can do at the Etihad as an away team. This is a place where Real Madrid and Bayern Munich have struggled to win, and Liverpool and struggled to win. Arsenal didn't win there last year, and they finished second. It's just a Manchester City team that was as weak as you could possibly want them to be on paper. There was, and they managed to really quieten Haaland. He got a few shots away in the second half, but nothing really to threaten. And he missed the target on a couple of occasions as well. So I thought Botman and Schär were at the level that you would, if everyone was at that level, then Newcastle would have got something out the game. But there was just a lack of something. I don't know if it was just a confidence issue. I don't know if it was a tactical question. I don't think it was, because Eddie Howe was talking about what he wanted to do. But I thought at the start he made the right choice to soak up the pressure at the back and have a deep defensive line, but spring on the counter attack. Anthony Gordon was lively early on and was probably one of Newcastle's best players, but it didn't help that he got booked and nearly got, and arguably could have been sent off. I don't think that there was enough in the second one really, but there's a question there. He came off. Harvey Barnes didn't really impact the game either. So generally speaking, there was just a lot of lacking in Newcastle going forward. I thought that it was disappointing. They could have done much more, and if they had done much more, they probably would have got a point. That said, Manchester City didn't really get out of third gear in the second half. They kept Newcastle at arm's length after really making that decisive tactical move in the first half with Foden, who was fantastic, by the way. This is a place where Newcastle have never won in the league. This is a place where most teams get beaten, but Man City were not at their best, and perhaps they didn't have to be at their best, and that's what's most frustrating. I think that'll be what's frustrating for Eddie Howe when he watches the game back today. I think Joelinton was nowhere to be seen. Mateo Kovacic was fantastic in almost man-marking him, taking him out the game. So in that transition, Newcastle couldn't utilise him, and he's one of it shows how important he is to Newcastle's best performances. That when he gets running forward, Newcastle are a much bigger threat. Guardiola and Man City recognised that. Kovacic executed that perfectly, but also helped dictate the game as well in a better way than Bruno and Tonali did. And I think that's also a little bit disappointing. This is not the end of the world. This is a defeat at Manchester City, and a narrow defeat at that. And Man City didn't create too much. Newcastle were in the game. It was competitive. You get the sense that they really wanted to get to the end of the game, which is something that Man City have never really been in a position against Newcastle. It's always been very comfortable. This was a little bit too comfortable for me in the context and the situation, but I think it shows the progress. It shows how far they've still got to go, which everybody knew. I think it's brought a few people outside, externally down to earth again. I don't think Newcastle will be in the title picture this season, but I don't think anyone ever thought that they would be. I think they'll be right in the Champions League picture. That's the middle ground between the Villa game last week and this one here. They'll be back at their best against Liverpool next week. They will have a really good chance of winning that game, given that Liverpool will also have players missing, and it's back at St James's Park. Their intensity is there, the fans are there, everything is set at St James's. They're really, really strong there. You know, this is a really difficult start, and it's great to have these games at this point in the season where teams are still feeling each other out, and this is a good starting point for Newcastle to build from and they know where Man City are at their level and how they can get a bit closer to them next time. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll be back in the week with another video. 84 subscribers now, so keep going. I really want to get to that 100 as soon as possible. Like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.